Hello class, Dr. Bauer's office hours here, and today we're going to talk about utilitarianism, the first ethical theory for our course, a consequentialist ethical theory, and here are some study guide questions to help you begin. 1. What is utilitarianism? 2. What is the principle of utility? 3. Why does Rachel's describe utilitarianism as a revolution in ethics? 4. What are some positive features of utilitarianism? 5. What is the utilitarian procedure for deciding whether something is morally right or morally wrong? 6. What is the general utilitarian view about euthanasia? 7. What are some strange exceptions to the general utilitarian view about euthanasia? 8. What is the general utilitarian view about the use of non-human animals? 9. What might be objectionable about the general utilitarian view of non-human animals? All right. Those are our study guide questions, and as usual, you may want to have a piece of paper and a pencil or something to write with as you follow along in order to fill out the answers of the study guide questions as they come up. So first things first, what exactly is utilitarianism? Well, it's a certain view of ethics, that is, it's a philosophical account of what it is to be morally valuable or what it is to be morally good. And it is based on the principle of utility, also known as the greatest happiness principle. This is a principle or a rule or an idea that was defined a couple of times by utilitarianism's founders, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, and we could paraphrase the principle this way, that an action is morally right to the extent that it maximizes happiness in the affected parties, and an action is morally wrong to the extent that it causes the affected parties pain. That's the principle. It's a principle which connects two things. One, moral value, being morally right or morally wrong, and two, pain or pleasure, a sort of felt affect, pleasure or pain. That's the idea behind the principle of utility. You'll note the locution to the extent that. What does that mean? An action is morally right to the extent that it maximizes pleasure in the affected parties. To the extent that. To the extent that just means as much as. That's what the phrase means. So if it says an action is morally right to the extent that it maximizes pleasure in the affected parties, that just means this. An action is morally right as much as it causes pleasure. The more pleasure it causes, the more morally right it is. Note, however, that it's not just your own personal pleasure. The principle of utility says that you look at everyone and you see how your actions will affect them, everyone. If your action produces an overall increase in pleasure, then it's morally right. But if your action overall makes more people in pain than pleasure, if it decreases people's pleasure overall for everyone affected, then it's morally bad. Let's talk about what James Rachel's has to say about this. Remember, the reading for this lecture is Chapter 7 of the Rachel's book, which is posted on Blackboard. Rachel's describes utilitarianism as a revolution in ethics. What exactly does he mean by that? Well, utilitarianism was first concocted, or at least formulated, by Jeremy Bentham in the 1780s, and that happened to be around the same time that the peasants of Paris were performing this France Revolution thing, and all across Europe and in its colonies, you had the rule of kings and queens being replaced by the rule of investors and people that had lots of money and property. Capitalism was coming to replace feudalism, and with it, a new way of looking at the world came along. Utilitarianism was an ethics of the Enlightenment, the period which followed feudalism, the period that came after those revolutions like the French Revolution and the American Revolution and all those reforms that led to new governments in Britain and the like, Belgium. Beforehand, feudal ethics included the divine right of kings, this ethical idea that certain people ought to be in charge by divine decree because God says so. You also had different sorts of ethics for different members of society, depending on whether you lived in the country or if you lived in the city, depending on whether you were a serf or a nobleman. A whole different set of laws may well apply to you, and a whole different set of ethics may well apply to you. In fact, there's an interesting history on a series of wars that broke out between the College of Oxford and the town of Oxford due to the inability of the students and the townspeople to actually live under the same laws. You should look it up. Also, feudal ethics had values which were based on scripture. The idea that right and wrong was a matter of what the Bible said. And remember, in the Middle Ages, you couldn't just read the Bible. Even if you were lucky enough to be able to read, what you probably read was the language that you spoke, and that wasn't the language that the Bible was in. So, under feudalism, you had this series of ethics where kings had a divine right to rule society, where there were different laws for different sorts of people, and where if you wanted to know the truth about why certain things were right and wrong, you needed to consult this deep and ponderous work of scripture that was inaccessible to you. Contrast that with the principle of utility, which says that if you want to know what makes something morally right, you look at what makes everyone happy. And if you want to know what makes something morally wrong, you look at what hurts people. That's what the principle of utility says. That moral rightness is a matter of making people feel good, and moral wrongness is a matter of, well, making them feel bad. That rightness and wrongness are a matter of how you treat the world in terms of its feelings, how you treat others and everyone around you. Right and wrong are a matter of pleasure and pain, respectively. That's utilitarianism. The principle of utility is rather simple. It treats everyone equally. It says, if you feel pleasure, and if you're affected by someone's action, then that positively features in the evaluation of their action. So when utilitarianism comes along and it says, look, to be morally right is to just make everyone feel good, and to be morally bad is to make everyone feel bad, that is markedly different, a radical difference in kind when it comes to ethical thinking. Utilitarianism, the principle of utility, it doesn't care about the divine right of kings. All that matters is pleasure or pain. It doesn't care whether you're a nobleman or a serf, a student or a city dweller. It doesn't care about that. Only pleasure and pain matters. And as for the question of how you know whether something is morally good or morally bad, well, you can feel it. Does it feel good or does it feel bad? That's how you know how to morally judge it. When you consider the simplicity of the principle of utility, and you contrast it with the complexity or the apparent complexity of medieval ethics, as Rachel describes it, you can see why he calls it a revolution in ethics. Now, before we discuss utilitarianism in more specific cases, here are some generally positive features of utilitarianism. First of all, utilitarians get to be ethical monists. This is a rather simple view on ethics. Overall, simpler views are better. If your view posits simpler things, if you don't multiply entities beyond necessity, as Occam's razor says, then overall it's a better theory. Simpler theories are better. And in ethics, the simplest theory is the theory that says, well, there's only one thing that matters when it comes to what's good. Pleasure. Or whatever it is that you may think happens to be, but that would be an ethically monist theory, and it would be a simple theory. Utilitarianism is ethically monist. It says that the only thing that matters is pleasure, and so it gets to count as being simple. Secondly, utilitarianism counts everyone as mattering equally when it comes to ethics. According to utilitarianism, there aren't any special privileged people who matter more. If you feel pleasure or if you can hurt, then you matter. Everyone who hurts matters. Kings, queens, servants, and students, all the same. Finally, you don't need to know all the truths about religion in order to know why stuff is right or wrong, according to utilitarianism. That's a relief too. That's a nice thing that makes the theory work well, is that you can have discussions about whether something is right or wrong, and those discussions don't immediately take you into some exegetical biblical scholarship that's very complicated and you have to interpret what God wants and stuff. No, very simple to use. Right? Those are some merits of utilitarianism. It's ethically monist, it treats people equally, and you don't have to know deep spiritual truths in order to do ethics. So, according to the utilitarian, if you want to know whether something is morally right or morally wrong, if you're considering a course of action and you want to know, is this the right thing to do? You stop, you consider who is affected by this action, you ask, does it make them feel better? Does it make them feel worse? Do I feel better? Do I feel worse? And you take the overall change and how people feel. Overall, do people feel better as a result? Overall, do people feel worse as a result? And you decide, based on that, whether the action is morally right or morally wrong. If overall, as a result of your action, everyone feels better, then it's a good thing to do. But if overall, as a result of your action, more people feel worse, then it's a bad thing to do. Let's take a real example. So you're at work, and let's say that there's a fridge that everyone puts their lunch in, and you didn't bring your lunch, but there's a lunch there that you could eat. It's not yours, but if you ate it, you would feel better. So let's consider, is this the right thing to do? To eat someone else's lunch? According to the utilitarian, you're supposed to first ask, who would be affected by this? Well, you would be affected, your hunger would go away. The person who brought that lunch who wanted to eat it, who was planning on eating it, they would be affected too, presumably negatively. They would be disappointed. Then there's your co-workers. How would they feel if they learned that the fridge that they put their lunches in might not be secure? That they can't count on being able to put their lunches in that fridge because one of their coworkers tried it and their lunch was eaten. It'll probably negatively affect them too. Then, of course, there's other coworkers that might have the responsibility of then briefing everyone on what the fridge is for and attempting to correct whatever mistake they perceive to have been made concerning the fridge and its use. It looks like there's quite a few people that are affected, and notice that most of them are affected negatively. You might enjoy the lunch, but the person who brought it is affected negatively. The HR or whoever is going to have to account for this is affected negatively, and the overall attitude of your coworkers may be affected negatively. So we could say in general, yeah, it's morally bad, according to utilitarianism, to take someone else's lunch. Now, change the situation. What if no one would notice that lunch missing? What if someone brought that lunch, they dropped it off, and then they realized, oh my goodness, I have something else to do, and they left, and they're actually going to forget about that lunch. They're not even going to remember that they brought it and left it. If no one else ate it, they might find it weeks later and be like, oh my goodness, I left this thing. Furthermore, no one else would notice you taking that lunch. Now, if that were the case, how, according to the utilitarian, should we evaluate it? Is it morally okay? According to the utilitarian, yeah, absolutely. No harm, no foul, as they say, right? You take a look at who's affected by the action. You, positively. The person who brought the lunch, not at all. Coworkers, not at all. And because they're not affected, HR, not at all. It's all good. So in that case, it would be okay to take their lunch, according to the utilitarian. So that's what utilitarianism is about. Notice that you don't say, if you're thinking like a utilitarian, that's wrong because it's stealing. No. Whether it's stealing or not doesn't settle the question of whether it's right or wrong for the utilitarian. What settles the question is, who's it going to affect? What happens? Does it make more people happy or sad? That will tell you whether it's right or wrong. Now, moving from a case like taking someone's lunch to a more controversial case that there are real ethical debates about, let's consider euthanasia. What is euthanasia? Well, the Greek prefix eu, meaning good, and thanos, meaning death. By the way, that's where that Marvel villain gets his name, Thanatos, Thanos, death. Euthanasia means good death, and it's the medical term in English that we use to describe someone who is in a terminal condition that's painful, who, of sound mind, requests that their life be ended. We sometimes call it medically assisted suicide or doctor-assisted suicide. Euthanasia is, at least for the purpose of this lecture and our discussion, when a party wishes to end their life as a result of a debilitating condition and they're in their sound mind when they request it. So someone being forced to commit suicide under threat or duress, or someone being driven insane and made to do it, that's not euthanasia. It's specifically someone who is afflicted, who's of sound mind, who because of their affliction decides that they want to die and they seek medical assistance for that. So, what would a utilitarian say about euthanasia? In general, utilitarians tend to think this, that if someone is suffering from intense pain and they desperately want it to end, and the cessation of that person's life, although it causes a little bit of suffering for their loved ones, overall decreases the suffering in the world, well, then it's morally good. Euthanasia is morally good. You should allow people to end their suffering. You should allow people to decrease the overall pain that there is in the world if they themselves are suffering so much that they don't want to be alive. That's the general idea. Now, when we consider the idea that the way that utilitarians evaluate euthanasia, it's really important to think clearly about this. The utilitarians are not thinking that, the person who is suffering will feel better once they're euthanized. No, that's not what they're thinking. Once they're euthanized, they presumably won't feel anything, unless we start talking about philosophy of religion stuff. No, think of it this way, that there's an overall painometer, like an energy life bar or something in a video game, right? Like there's an overall level of pain in the world. And the greater that level, the worse things are, morally speaking, right? You want that meter to go down, right? You want it to decrease, right? And here's this person, right? They're in a lot of pain, and they say, I want my life to end. That'll cause the pain to decrease. So yeah, you want that to go down. That would be overall good. The utilitarian does not think that euthanasia is good because it's a relief to the euthanized. Nor do they think it's good because the euthanized have some kind of right to their own life, right? As we will soon see, utilitarians aren't very big on the notion of rights at all. No, the reason why utilitarians approve of euthanasia in general is specifically because euthanasia is a policy which allows the overall suffering in the world to decrease. Of course, in certain situations, very specific weird ones, a utilitarian could be made to oppose euthanasia. Suppose there's a particular beloved celebrity, call them celebrity, and that they are so beloved by everyone that the entire world will suffer a lifelong nervous breakdown if celebrity dies. A lifelong nervous breakdown for billions of people from which they will never recover, utterly reducing the world to a crawl and emotional despair and depression that they could never recover from if anything happens to celebrity. And it just so happens that celebrity is in the terminal stages of a painful cancer and desperately does want to be euthanized. Is it okay to euthanize celebrity, according to the utilitarian? Normally it would be, but if you just increase the amount and the number of people who would suffer as a result, it's no longer okay, right? Once the scales tip, right? Once the euthanization of celebrity leads to more suffering, then it's no longer okay to do. Again, it doesn't have to do with the idea that celebrity has a right to their life and they should be able to decide what happens to it. It doesn't have to do with any sort of personal relief on celebrity's part. It's just a matter of how it affects overall pleasure and pain, societally speaking, right? And if you cobble together a fun situation where a person who you'd ordinarily think should be euthanized would be the cause of incredible widespread suffering if they were, that's a funny way to get the utilitarian to switch their position on euthanasia. Right. Okay, so let's talk about Matthew Donnelly and Harold Donnelly from the reading, right? Matthew Donnelly is an X-ray technician. He was exposed to X-rays over the course of his life and as a result developed a very painful cancer. The cancer became terminal and Matthew Donnelly suffered so much that he wanted his life to end. He was specifically requested his brothers to kill him. They refused. Only one of them actually eventually relented, Harold Donnelly, who killed Matthew Donnelly, a sort of mercy killing, a kind of euthanasia. And there's a question about whether Harold committed murder, whether he did something wrong. This being a normal case of euthanasia, one in which the bereaved were sad to see their beloved family member go, but not so sad as to outweigh the cessation of suffering that resulted from the euthanasia, the utilitarian would say that it's okay, it's not murder. Other, perhaps feudally minded, medievally minded ethics would say that it is indeed murder because, say, every life is sacred, or every person should die at their own natural time, or something about natural functions, proper functions, something like that. So, we've seen what the utilitarian view of euthanasia is and how it can get a little weird if you cobble together a situation where euthanizing someone would actually cause more overall pain than the cessation of pain. Let's turn to the topic of non-human animals and ask, how do utilitarians feel about them? You know, cats and dogs, and not just the cute animals, of course. You could talk about wasps and cockroaches, and you might even talk about slugs and snails. I bet they feel pain. Anything that can feel pain or feel pleasure is morally relevant, according to the utilitarian. Remember, the principle of utility says that an action is morally right as much as it causes pleasure in the affected parties. If something can feel pleasure and it is affected, then it matters for the moral calculus. So, according to the utilitarian, you cannot just consider the effects of your actions on other people. You also have to consider the effects of your actions on animals. If you get mad at one of your friends and you start yelling at them in a loud, aggressive voice, you should not only consider your friend's feelings, but also the feelings of their dog who's nearby, who might be terrified of this. You consider them as much as you might consider a person who would be terrified of such a violent outburst, right? Their feelings matter. Anything that can feel pleasure or pain matters, according to the utilitarian. Or at least that's how the ethical creed goes. One thing that this means is that utilitarians are frequently vegetarians. They think that overall, if it's possible to avoid eating meat, and if it's possible to avoid having animals painfully slaughtered in the factory farm system, just so that we can get a small amount of pleasure eating them. Remember, utilitarian calculus, if an animal gets slaughtered, a lot of pain for it. The pleasure of eating a burger, well, it's great, I love burgers, but compared to the animal's slaughter, maybe not as much. Many utilitarians, they're thinking of that and they say, yeah, the proper thing to do is to be vegetarian. Many utilitarians are also very critical of or skeptical towards certain kinds of animal testing. It's one thing to use animals to test for diabetes medication or for medicine that's needed to help keep people alive or to save lives or to prevent deaths. But what about the painful torture and death of animals just to see whether this new kind of lipstick is cool? Is that all right? In that case, the utilitarian would say no. And because of their focus on pleasure and pain, features which are common to humans and non-human animals alike, you find utilitarians embroiled in the ethics of animals, in the ethics of non-human animals. Can you eat them? Can you use them? Can you keep them? Can you befriend them? Can you domesticate them? What's okay? Do animals consent? Things like this. And these are all interesting questions. They are of a distinctly utilitarian character because the way to engage with those questions is to focus on animal suffering. Suffering being the thing that makes something morally wrong according to utilitarians. When we move on to look at Kant and Plato, we'll find that there's less of a focus on non-human animals, and that's simply because, according to them, what makes stuff right or wrong has nothing to do with pleasure or anything else that non-human animals partake in. It has to do with something else. But getting ahead of ourselves. For now, try to keep in mind what the principle of utility is and how it applies to certain sorts of situations. Taking someone's lunch, euthanasia, non-human animals. What would the utilitarian say about software piracy? What would the utilitarian say about police brutality? What would the utilitarian say, if they were ideologically consistent, about social inequality? It's worth asking in a time like this. In any case, I'll see you next lecture. Thanks very much for watching. Stay tuned for more.